So, get to come up here today and talk to you all about Matthew 15, which is our next chapter. Last chapter, we went through a little bit with the feeding of the 5,000 and some other context. And today, we're coming into kind of the second half of that dramatic unit. If you think of chapters 14 and 15 as one extended story, that's going to be a really useful piece of context. But first, I really did want to do what I always do and talk about Star Wars. There's a reason for this. So this is my favorite ship in the entirety of the Star Wars universe. It's the B-Wing Starfighter. I think it's a beautiful ship. It's pretty. It looks cool. It does some weird things where it rotates odd ways. In the novelization of Return of the Jedi, like a B-Wing squadron just took out a Star Destroyer completely. And the only reason that Lando and Wedge got out after they blew up the Death Star, because, Lando threw the fireball, was because the B-Wings blasted open a hole for them. It's really, really cool. It's a really fun ship. And you barely see it anywhere in the movie. Because as you can see from the front and really from the sides, it's really skinny. And so it just didn't show up when they shot the model against a green screen. They tried, and there's like 4 shots from the very beginning, and mostly you're looking at the backs. You can see the engines glow. But after they get to the Death Star and they all scatter because it's a trap, you never see it anywhere in any shots ever again in the entire movie. Lucasfilm spent thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a ship they used for 5 shots in a movie that in some of those scenes had hundreds in shots. And so really, in a lot of respects, this thing failed in its basic task. Everyone who approved it, from George Lucas on down to the concept artist, the green screen guys, the guy, Dave Dykstra, who invented the technology, they all failed because they spent all that time and all that money on something that didn't do the one job that it had, which was to look good on screen. And that's going to come back a couple of times in this sermon. So for a little bit of context, we've been in Galilee, and remember from a couple of weeks ago, or now months, I guess, pericopes, the idea that all of these little episodes, all of these little stories are units. And so Peter or John or Paul or any of the apostles or any of the disciples, as they're going around evangelizing in the years after Jesus dies and they're building the church, they've told these stories hundreds of times. And all the rough edges have been kind of worn off, and they're these little distinct units. And then when the Gospels are written, they are put together in a way that makes dramatic sense, but is not necessarily a historical order. So these are all little units. They probably happen close together. They probably happen a couple times. Or something very similar did, but they don't necessarily have a straight through line except what was imposed by the gospel writers when they put these together in order. But for context, Jesus has been up in Galilee. Galilee is the northern half of Judea, Judea proper, and then Samaria, and then Galilee is above that. And of those, they're now controlled by various children and grandchildren of Herod the Great. And realistically, Judea is like the fancy Jewish part. It's Jewish. Samaria, they're Samaritans, not really. And then Galilee is like redneck land. They're Jewish, but they're redneck Jews. So they're back in the back of nowhere, basically. And Jesus had just gone home, just gone back to his hometown, Nazareth, and he just not really had a good reception. And a lot of stuff had happened, and because of their lack of faith, he did very few miracles there. And then in the immediate previous chapter, chapter 14, the other part of our story, we've had the beheading of John the Baptist. His forerunner, his cousin, the guy who was leading the way, he's been murdered by Herod, one of the children of Herod the Great. Then we've had the feeding of the 5,000, which was a great miracle. And then immediately afterwards, the mob is going to make Jesus king. He's got to run away, or else they'll try and make him be king. And then there's this episode of walking on water. The apostles are on the boat. They're going across the Sea of Galilee. Jesus comes out walking on water. It's a really cool miracle. And Peter's like, tell me to come to you. And he walks for like 2 steps, and then he gets scared, and he starts sinking. So it's been kind of, good stuff's happened, but a lot of bad stuff has happened along with it, a lot of failure. And we're going to come back to that in a minute, too. There's three main stories in this chapter. The first one is kind of that which defiles. That's verses 1 through 20. Whoop, almost dropped it. Verses 1 through 20. And what happens is the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they come up to Galilee. So, the fancy city boys went on up to redneck land to tell them what for, to tell them, how things are really supposed to run. You're supposed to really get this idea that they're the intruders, they're the interlopers. And they come in and they tell the disciples who were just getting some grain and kind of rubbing off the husk and eating it. Oh, previous chapter, sorry. They were eating without washing their hands. I've had a wild morning, and so I apologize because I'm a little scattered. And they say, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? And so what they're doing is they're asking why the disciples weren't following not the law, not the prophets, not stuff from God, but this tradition of post-exile, oral, so not written down, rules that were very meticulous and very precise, and they had come from kind of the Pharisees. So it's kind of like, oh gosh, my brain just dropped completely. Awesome. It's kind of like you're driving along, and you come to a stop sign, and you stop. Come to a complete and full stop, and then you go. And you get pulled over by not the police, by some guy, and he's like a teenager, and he's got a hat that says security, and yellow lights on the car, not blues and reds. And he's like, why didn't you stop long enough? Why didn't you look both ways for 4 seconds each? Why are you breaking the tradition of my security company? And you're sitting there going, son, I have children as old as you, because at this point I do. 2, I don't see a badge. And 3, what are you talking about? The law is the law. Regulations are regulations. The prophets are the prophets. Your tradition is very nice for you, but not for everybody else. And so Jesus' response is he just recontextualizes the question completely changes the context. And he asks, well, why do you, the Pharisees, break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Why are you, security guard, holding up traffic, the point of the traffic laws, to impose your little tradition? Which is, again, the smart city boys came into redneck land, and now this hobo preacher is asking them why they're violating God's law. Who does he think he is? And so they're kind of offended here. Because what he's basically asking is, Pharisees, why aren't you being good Jews? You're accusing my guys of that, but you're the one breaking it worse. And it's a really, really fun reversal that Jesus pulls. And then further on, he contrasts man's laws with God's. There's God's law. That's what's important. That's what needs to be followed. And your rules, well, they're nice, but they're not important. And if we think about our lives today, we can see this all over the place. Because people are really, really good at finding loopholes. We are really good at finding things that we can get around. I stopped for that, officer. Absolutely I did. Yeah, it was for a microsecond. You may not have seen it, but I stopped for that stoplight even though the wheels kept moving. Or I was going 10 over, but everybody else is going 15 over, so I'm actually being safe. All these rules where we say, yeah, there's a law, but there's an exception for me in some way. And in fact, Jesus specifically highlights the exceptions where he says, hang on, you Pharisees say, so God says, honor your father and mother. By the way, my parents are here, so tell them I did a good job, even if I didn't. Honor your father and mother. But the Pharisees say, well, if I take what I would use to support them in their old age like I'm supposed to, if I take that money and I dedicate it to the temple, hey, maybe even hold on to it a little while first, then that's okay. I don't have to honor my father and mother that way because I'm honoring God by dedicating this to the temple. And when you say it like that, you go, ooh, that's jerk mode, isn't it? Wow, that's terrible. But for the Pharisees, that was a rule. They could do that. And then he quotes Isaiah. And Isaiah, if you want to talk about a super prophet, that's Isaiah. Moses, super prophet law. Isaiah, super prophet castigating the people. And he quotes Isaiah. He says, these people, the Pharisees, honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, but their teachings are but rules taught by men. And it's a really, really nice encapsulation of their hearts aren't with God at all. They are not actually focused on righteousness. They're focused on the religion. And this is another thing that it's actually kind of a pet peeve of mine, or my personal hobby horse, is the idea of God and religion and those two in conflict. And we've seen many, 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 many times religious ideas religions going completely off the rails because they stop worshiping God and start worshiping rules or structure or our own personal temporal power. And there's absolutely no better example than why we're in a Reformed church building, because the entire reason the Protestant Reformation happened was the Christian church got more and more and more into temporal power and less and less and less about God. And to the point where you have actual, honest to goodness, monks and priests rebelling against the church, saying, this can't be right. So, I improvise more when I'm tired, apparently. Cool. The other thing that I think is really interesting that people do that's horrible is we bring in someone else to prove we're right. How many times have you been talking to somebody about, let's say, oh, my leg hurts, I think I might have sprained my ankle. Someone else says, well, I talked to a doctor, and they think based on those symptoms, it's really bone cancer. Or your stomach hurts. Well, oh, really? Well, I read this thing by this renowned Mayo Clinic physician. He says it's really such and such thing. It's actually a fallacy. It's called an appeal to authority. Person you can't talk to, but who's really important, says I'm right, so I must be right. Don't look at the evidence, just look at my authority. And that's a lot of times what the Pharisees were doing. In the church, we actually call that proof texting. Oh, don't look at the argument, don't look at the reason, just look at this one verse I pulled out of context. God says I'm right. Well, no. The little bit you pull out of context says you're right, but context is important. And I think the most important part of this, though, is that the Pharisees were acting like their rules are superior to God's authority and God's law, which is exactly the opposite. Normally, I mark my slides where the transitions are. Yeah, okay. So Jesus, having embarrassed the Pharisees and turned their own question on them, does not stop there. And this is starting to get to dangerous level, because remember, we're in basically a Roman dictatorship. The Pharisees they're not in cahoots with the Romans. That would be more the Sadducees. But they have enough soft power that if the Pharisees kill some hobo preacher in the middle of nowhere, the Romans aren't going to care that much. But Jesus decides he's going to confront them more directly. He calls in the crowd. Hey, everybody. And he's pulling in thousands of people. We just fed 5,000 a chapter ago. Hey, everybody, come over here. We're going to talk about this some more. Crowd gathers. And Jesus then says, listen and understand, which is, you listen to me and you understand, because you obviously don't understand yet, Pharisees. What goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean. In other words, he's saying, you Pharisees, your rules are all about what you eat, how you wash your hands, all the things that come to you and how you address them on the outside. But it's like you're a passive participant. It's all coming to you. But what comes out of his mouth, Jesus says, in other words, here's the real rule. What comes out of him, that's what makes him unclean. And then he lists a few later. Things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. In other words, dirt, unclean food, not washing your hands, eating at the wrong time, the wrong people. None of that all just kind of bounces off of you. It's what comes out of you, what comes out of your heart that reveals who you really are, whether or not you are clean or unclean in your soul, where it matters. And that really upset the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees, if you want to think of them in terms of like stereotypes, every single stereotype about horrible ambulance-chasing lawyers, that's the Pharisees. Hyper-legalistic, hyper-argumentative, really not going to pay attention to what you're saying because they know they're right. That's the Pharisees. And what he's saying to them is, you got all of this wrong, and I just publicly embarrassed you by showing you. And the Pharisees this bothers them a lot, because what Jesus is saying is that righteousness is not man's righteousness. Because man's righteousness is mechanical. It is or it isn't. You can look at it. It's rule-based. It's objective. You can measure it. It's quantifiable. It's verifiable. It is external. I know if I'm speeding because the cop has a radar gun or a LiDAR gun. And it, with science, bounces a beam off and comes back, and it's measurable. And depending on what reading it gives, I was going over the speed limit or not. Bada boom, bada bing. It is provable to other people. But God's righteousness is a question of character. It is completely internal or on a spiritual plane. It's not something that I can see in your heart. Only God can see in our hearts. It's whether or not you're kingdom focused. Or another way to say it is, it's a symptom of righteousness, how you act. It's not a cause of righteousness. And I'm going to pick on someone who's not here to talk about this, and that's going to be Chip Lind. Janet reacted, yes. So if you don't know Chip, Chip's married to Janet. Chip is one of my favorite people in the world. He is great. He is a kind man. He is godly. He is studious. He's like this big, gruff teddy bear. And I love Chip to death. If you ever had a conversation with him, every time he's telling a story, no matter what he's talking about or who he's telling it about, he almost, I see John knows where I'm going, he almost always refers to people by their first and last name and tells you a relationship. Bob Smith and I were walking down the street, and Bob and I know each other from college, and we roomed together for 6 years. We're walking down the street, and there's these pigs and a fire truck, and we all fall in the mud. Hilarious. But he always pays attention to those little details about people. He always tells you about them and about how they're important to him. He shows, it slips out, that he remembers people, that he cares about all the little things about them. And it should be the same with us. As we're talking and going about our lives and talking about our jobs or our children or our families or things that are going on, it should slip out that we're Christian. It should slip out that we have a kingdom focus. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. That's what righteousness looks like, is you can't help but it come out of you. Not, oh, I'm so careful to follow all the rules and I'm making sure that you notice. So it's very, very different. And that's one piece, the slipping out. The second piece is your focus. And I want to come back to the B-wing now. So if you've been paying attention, the last, 2 years now, I use Star Wars examples a lot. Because it's something I'm very familiar with, very comfortable with. And a couple of months ago now, Andrew and I had a really brief conversation. He just gave me a little bit of feedback. Hey, kind of a crutch, you're leaning on it too much. You probably want to do some different examples. And I came back to that. I came back and did the B-wing today because it was a really good example. And then Friday night, I can't sleep, thinking about the sermon, and I go, drat. Because I realized what was really going on. I don't like being told no. I don't like in an area that I think I'm an expert in, someone telling me I did a bad job. So, Andrew, with all of the niceness in the world, absolutely no negative connotations here, gave me some extremely constructive, helpful feedback. And I was like, I can do it anyways. I'm going to do this anyways. And it became about me and my ego, and not about me up here telling you and you on the stream about God. And that's the other problem with the Pharisees and their point of view. It's about them and their ego, and it's not about God, which is what it should be. In a few more chapters, we'll get to Matthew 18 with the little children. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble because they can't stop talking about Star Wars, for example, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. I cannot tell you if the example of B-wing is good because I think it's good because it's Star Wars, or I think it's good because I made an objective analysis of whether or not it actually made my point. I can't. Which means it's not the example I shouldn't have used it. And if I had a better one, I would have used it instead. And so the correct response here would have been to make this not about me, even if I can objectively say, Star Wars, good. Great example. Mechanically, objectively, quantifiably, verifiably, it's a good example. Because it's about me being right, not about me explaining God. And so, but now it is, because I changed it. So that is the other thing to think about here is not just the symptom coming out, but also your focus and about what you're really trying to accomplish here. So that's the first story. That's kind of a humdinger. The second one is the one I liked the... Oh, yeah, sorry, slides. So the next one is, I think, the heart of the story. And if you think about chapters 14 and 15 as one story, this is the climax, this is the high point. So Jesus is up in Galilee. He goes up to Tyre and Sidon. So Tyre and Sidon, if you think of modern Israel, they're up in Lebanon. They're just over the border. And he's in Gentile territory. And this is going to be important in a second. So a Canaanite woman, not a Jew, a Gentile, begs Jesus to heal her daughter. The daughter is demon-possessed. And Jesus doesn't really answer her. The disciples do, but he really doesn't say much. And she begs again. And Jesus says this fascinating exchange. Jesus says he's only sent to the lost sheep of Israel, not to the Canaanites. And she then kneels down, and really what you're supposed to be thinking, she pays homage to a king. She acknowledges his authority as a ruler by kneeling and begs for help. Not because he has to, because Jesus is nice. And then Jesus says, it's not right to take the children's bread, the Jewish people, and toss it to their dogs, which is kind of a jerk thing to say, honestly. But then she responds, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And which, to our mind, United States, 21st century, individual culture, individualistic culture, don't disrespect me. This is horrible. He's calling her a dog. He's telling her no. He's, making her beg. What is going on here? Is Jesus just rubbing her face in the idea that she's not Jewish and that helping her is some distraction from his real job? But I want to go back to our context we talked about earlier. Because this woman, she succeeds through humility. She works within God's framework, and she doesn't try to make Jesus do what she wants. Because remember, in chapter 14, we've had Herod, who kills John the Baptist. He wanted power. He wanted to violate social mores and marry his sister and lust after his stepdaughter. And he kills a prophet of God, really because he just didn't want to lose face. He didn't want to lose some prestige. He wanted that power and prestige, even if it meant disobeying God. That wasn't important. Power and prestige was. Then feeding the 5,000. Jesus does this massive miracle, feeds 5,000 people from loaves and fish, and they're going to seize him and make him king. The people wanted a king, even though that's not Jesus' ministry. And then walking on water, the disciples and Peter. First, they've just seen massive miracles, and they somehow don't think Jesus is going to do a sequel, which is weird because that's been their life the last couple of years. But more importantly, they are scared. They don't have faith in any sort of persistent way. Peter's like a Labrador retriever. Yes, God. No, lightning, thunder. Yes, God. He's like, God, let me walk out to you. Oh, no, and he sinks. And that just inconsistency. They want the Savior. They want the magic show of it, but they don't want the struggle or the commitment of being a disciple. And now we've had the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the super Jews. They are the people, if anyone in all of Israel you were going to put bets on would go, that's the Messiah. Yes, he's here. It would be the Pharisees. But they're his biggest critics, his biggest opponents. They want a tame God who'll boost their egos. They don't want to follow God. They want a God who says that they're right. So we've had over and over again, Jesus comes to people, shows he's God, and then they fail through their own egos, their own preconceptions, their own fear. And then this Canaanite, non-Jewish woman comes in, and all she wants is for the Messiah to heal her daughter. That is it. And when Jesus says, yeah, but my job is to minister to the Jews, she says, but you're not in Israel. You're in Gentile land. And I can get some crumbs from the table, right? Because it's not going to impact your ministry. You're already here. And this story is repeated in Mark. It is the only time in the entirety of the book of Mark that anyone addresses Jesus as Lord. It's this Canaanite woman who, according to the rules, the Jewish rules, doesn't belong. She's not in the people. And then Jesus says, "Woman, you have great faith," and immediately heals her daughter. In other words, of all those people, all 6 stories we get in these 2 chapters, she is the one who actually has great faith. Not Peter, who walked on water for a second. Not the Pharisees, who were following God's law as hard as they could. Not the people who wanted to make God king. This one woman who acknowledged and understood that God's way up here, and God's got authority and purpose and rules, and they don't always make sense. But I can't make God do it my way. And that's why she's the only one who gets what she wanted, what she asked for. And so Jesus isn't being a jerk. He's making a second point about salvation, about righteousness. It comes out of you, but it's entirely on God's terms. We're not in charge. And if we don't like God's rules, okay, that's our opinion. It's also irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And we can't make God do it our way. Because think about righteousness. What is sin? Like the definition of sin. Say what? Okay. A little bit more, missing the mark, separation from God. But in both cases, it's not doing what God says. God has told us how to be righteous. We don't do it. For whatever reason, usually one we think is okay. Kind of by definition, righteousness is doing things God's way. But if we're trying to make God do it our way, that means we're in charge. And the bacteria are not in charge of me. I'm the human, right? Same way, I'm the human, God's God. He's way up here. And there's there's a lot of really fun stories. These were actually the edits I did, and I'm going to pick on Veronica a little bit. I didn't warn her, by the way. So when we were in the hospital, so when Antha was born, my lovely older child, it was medically exciting, let's just put it that way. And so she had to be born by C-section. And we're in the hospital, and we're kind of getting ready to go into surgery, and Veronica is just utterly miserable, and especially she has a really, really dry mouth. But you're going into surgery, they're going to give you anesthesia, you can't take anything, not even water. General anesthesia, that's a good point. She was miserable. We're going to general anesthesia, not a epidural. And so, fortunately, I was not completely gone mentally, because later I was. And I asked the nurse to bring some ice chips. But the way I said it was, I know she can't take water. She knows she can't take water, but she's a really dry mouth. Can we just have some ice chips to just hold and let it kind of soak in? She won't swallow, won't drink anything. But what I did was I said, yes, I understand your rules, nurse, that the doctor made. I understand your authority, and the reality of why we have these rules, because we were already getting close enough to killing her. We didn't really want to kill Veronica on the table. Can we now do it this way, which will work and make everybody happy? I acknowledge their authority. I acknowledge why their authority was there, and we got our ice chips. Another really good story, when I was in school in New York, this was pre-9/11. It was really important. It was literally the day after finals. I am completely exhausted. Going through LaGuardia Airport, late at night, and LaGuardia is in New York City, and so it's full of New Yorkers who are famously polite, and going through security, and they take one of those little pads of gauze, and soaked in alcohol, and they rubbed it on my suitcase and stuck it in a machine. And for those of you who don't know, what the alcohol does is absorbs these molecules that come off of explosives, and those can then be detected when that evaporates in the machine. And the colloquial name for that is a bomb sniffer. And I was so tired that I was like, oh, you have a bomb sniffer. Neat. I said the B word in security at LaGuardia. And I should have been late for my flight, if you get my meaning there. But as it turns out, he realized that I was a dumb college student and also exhausted and let me through. But I got the dirtiest possible look for not respecting the rules and not respecting why the rules were there. And those are good examples in my thinking. So the last story we have is the feeding of the 4,000. This is in verses 29 and 39. And this is the reason I think that chapters 14 and 15 really are of a piece together. Chapter 14 starts the feeding of the 5,000 after the Herod bit, and now chapter 15 ends with the 4,000. those of you who hear people talk about errors in the Bible, this is officially one of them, because surely there weren't two feedings of some number of thousands of people. Matthew wrote them within 2 chapters of each other. I'm pretty sure he did that on purpose. Obviously, Jesus did this miracle multiple times. And it is a nice bookend to the story. So they're moving along the Lake of Galilee. I think they're kind of moving along the north side. So they're still kind of still in Gentile territory, kind of in Jewish territory. And the people have been following Jesus now for 3 days. Notice, by the way, this is about, say, 3-5 days after he defended the Pharisees so badly, and he still has this giant crowd. So the Pharisees were not a factor, apparently. But the people there believe. Unlike in Nazareth, where they didn't believe, here they do believe. He does tons and tons of miracles, tons of healings and things. And he's trying to send them back. He doesn't want them to collapse on the way back to their homes. And so we have almost a word-for-word repeat of the loaves and fishes. How much food do you have? Bring it here. Blesses it, passes it out. And they get passed out to these 4,000 people. And they collect 7 baskets of leftovers, which is kind of weird. Why have we gone to all the trouble to repeat this miracle, in some cases almost word for word, do we have fewer leftovers? That doesn't make sense. So I think what we're supposed to be doing is contrasting these two and wondering why the differences are there. Why 5 versus 4, which we're not going to talk about, but also why 12 baskets versus 7 baskets. And the reason is that the 5,000 is supposed to be Israel. It's supposed to be the 12 baskets, the 12 tribes. But we are now moving into semi-Jewish land, semi-Gentile, semi-Jewish land, out of just Jewish land, out of the realm of the 12 tribes, and we hit 7, which is the biblically perfect number. So anytime you see the word 7 anywhere in the Bible, it's generally like this is somehow perfect. And this is also after disappointment, Canaanite woman, she did it. So as we're moving more and more to righteousness, we go from the 12 tribes and a great miracle to this biblically perfect miracle. In other words, as we get more and more faith, we get more and more perfection. It's also this direct assertion of kingliness and power. To the extent I tend to focus on the military history aspect of the Bible, there are some utterly crazy logistical ramifications of the fact that Jesus can just take some random food and feed thousands, literally a full-sized army. If you ever look at, for example, Alexander the Great, one of the 2 main reasons he succeeded in conquering all of Iran and a good chunk of India and would have kept going was because he had all the logistics. He could actually feed his army, which was very, very difficult at that time. The Romans, a big chunk of the reason they had the Roman roads was to make logistics actually work, to actually be able to just feed all these guys. And the ability to basically just kind of airdrop food whenever you want. You find some random farmer, buy 10 loaves and a couple fish, and you feed thousands, multiple legions. That is a massive. Might just give them machine guns. It's such a huge game changer for an ancient army. And it's a Fisher King sort of thing. He takes care of his people. He protects and provides for his people. There's a lot of assertions of kingliness. But I think in this context, it's also just we are seeing the ministry get closer and closer to God. We're seeing the disciples and the people and the apostles all get more and more righteous. And so we see the power of God being expressed in bigger and bigger and more perfect ways. And that's an absolute application to our lives. The closer we get to God, the more we're going to see him. We can't force God, see point 2, to show us a big miracle to make us believe. That's not how it works. We believe in God, we get closer and closer, and then we'll see the big miracles. All right, so our application points. But this is also the other half of Andrew's feedback was I don't spend enough time on application, which is kind of funny because I don't. So the first one is to focus on God's righteousness, not on man's rules. And the idea here is righteousness should be just escaping out of you because you're constantly focusing on God and not on yourself. If people will see you as someone who, when you're not really paying attention to how you're presenting yourself, you don't act like a Christian, they don't think you're a Christian. Doesn't matter what you say, what you do. When in the sheep and the goats, and the goats say, God, I did all these things for you. Yeah, but what was going on when you weren't paying attention? What was flowing out of you when you weren't trying to show off to other people? Then, yeah, they're actually not righteous. They're just really good actors. And in your unguarded moments, it should just suddenly pop out, and you do something that just doesn't make sense unless you're a Christian, unless you're godly. Because if we're faking it, people will notice. We should also be trying to seek God on God's terms. We should be trying to acknowledge the power and the holiness and the righteousness of God. It's, we're 21st century Americans. The world revolves around us. And in a lot of respects, it actually does. I can go on Google right now and say, Google, AI, tell me how wonderful a person I am. And it will go to great lengths and kill many fish in order to tell me how wonderful I am. And I say, AI, are you just trying to butter me up? Oh, no, of course I'm not. It will go into even more great lengths to tell me how wonderful I am. I will go on Facebook or Reddit or some social media, and the algorithm will feed me more and more of how I'm already right. And I'll get more and more convinced that what I'm thinking, what I'm knowing is correct. But that's me being the God of my world. That's not God being the God of my world. We should be going instead to the Bible, to fellow Christians, people who of learning and trust, to look at the actual rules, the actual power and authority, and the actual righteousness in order to see how we're doing. Because when we work with God as God, from this position of, we're not that important in the big scheme of things. God treats us as massively important, which is a comment on his holiness, not on how important we actually are. When we treat God, as a supreme creator, ruler, and authority in the universe, then amazing stuff happens. And when we don't, then hooray, we have to be Pharisees. And then as we get closer and closer to perfection, as we grow more and more in faith, as you know, there's a science fiction or fantasy novel that has some sayings in it. It's called The Way of Kings. And one that's kind of crept out into the population is journey before destination. The idea that right now we're focusing on getting closer to God. Eventually we'll pass away, eventually we'll pass away and we'll get there. But right now we're just on this journey closer and closer and closer to God. And the more and more and more we get closer to him, the more and more we'll see of his righteousness. And we'll see of what God really is. And so right now it's to stay focused on just get closer and closer. You don't have to succeed, you just have to do better. And that is Matthew 15. So next week we'll talk with, Andrew will be back. We'll go through Matthew 16 and on until towards the end of the book. But now let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this chance to talk through your work. Thank you especially for your son, for the enormous sacrifice that you made for us, for bringing your word and the second chance that is salvation to us. Lord, we ask that you be with us. Help us to so completely internalize you that godliness just falls out when we're not paying attention, and that we, even and especially when we're not trying, serve as a witness for you. Help us as we move into the summer, as we move into trips and travel and family and all the little stressors of being in the summer. Help us to deal with those and to be focused on you. Now, let's go and join me in praying the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.